So, welcome to the Print Uninterrupted. Today, we are joined by Deborah Eisenman. Deborah, wonderful to have you here in studio today. Deborah is the Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer at the Asia Society and Founding Director and Senior Fellow of the Asia Society Policy Institute. And I was going through her illustrious CV. She has had a lot of experience in working as an election observer in the Western Balkans. You've been at Kosovo, in Albania, in Ukraine, and Armenia as well. So that makes you a very niche specialist of areas that we often don't study much in India. But what brings us here today and what we're going to be discussing today is her work on Myanmar. So in June 2018, she has authored the ASPI report, which is called Reconciling Expectations and Reality in a Transitioning Myanmar. So today we are going to be discussing Myanmar and all the dynamics therein. It remains to be a very volatile state, Deborah. And from India's perspective, we are often trying to make sense of what is going there because it's not just a very fragmented, fragile state per se in terms of political crisis on the one hand, and then a military coup and all the ethnic tensions on the other hand, but also because Myanmar is bordering four of India's northeastern states. Also, Myanmar borders, Bangladesh, and through Bangladesh, then of course there is another passage of so many refugees that find their way into India. So the situation remains fraught. As we are speaking, Myanmar has also been hit by an unfortunate earthquake, so that makes it another humanitarian crisis out there. But Deborah, if I can just pick your brains, and you're a specialist on that region, why Myanmar remains so volatile?
It's a great question, Swasti. Myanmar has been in the midst of a civil war for 75 years. So it has been in crisis for a very long time, has been under military leadership for decades, barring really almost 8 to 10 year top-down transition period in which Aung San Suu Kyi and her National League of Democracy were able to take power and bring in a number of reforms. With the coup that happened 4 years ago now, we've seen the country really fragment all over again. As I said, it's long been in civil war. You've had ethnic armed groups and the Tatmadaw, Myanmar's military, in consistent fighting. But now you're seeing that post-coup, the military is trying to regain control of a highly fragmented Myanmar. It has not even a complete control of half the country, so it's really only controlling the middle part of the country, and the ethnic organizations on the periphery are retaining local control. You have fighting not only of the ethnic armed groups, but also of a People's Defense Force that has come to rally against the Burmese military. And then you have political control fragmented as well. So with the ethnic armed groups, with the military, and also with some of the previously elected government that has retained kind of shadow or opposition power as a national unity government, whether they're in the country or in exile in Thailand or elsewhere.
So, I mean, in near future, then would it be reasonable to say that the future of Myanmar remains pretty splintered? Because I covered this issue at length, and there's a member that asked us a question on geopolitics with Swasti. And what also complicates this entire matter is that with this kind of a very decentralized chaos that we see in Myanmar, as you just mentioned, I think it also becomes a hub for all kinds of illegal trade, opium, weapons, and all of that. But what really makes it interesting, and please tell me because you're a specialist there, is that from India's perspective, we want to understand what is China's role. So, it's not just the junta that China supports by way of arms trades and all that, but it's also the pro-democracy forces and the rebel groups, etc., that they force. So China seems to be playing a kind of a double role there, or a game there, which is, engaging with all stakeholders. So what is China's ambitions and aspirations in Myanmar?
I'd say first and foremost, China likes stability on their borders. So as a method of policy, I think they engage with whoever is in charge of the country. I'm not convinced that they ideologically would align with the military government, but I think that they believe that as of this point, the military government is the entity that is providing the most tangible oversight of the country, and so that is who they prop up. So both through significant, legal channels of trade, significant investment into the country, significant arms provided to the military, whether it's artillery or jets or drones and things like that. But then you're right, there are these kind of inroads into both the ethnic armed groups as well as significant organized crime that I'm not convinced it's necessarily the Chinese government out of Beijing, but certainly Chinese actors engaging in really illicit channels of crime, particularly nearest their border, whether it's within the drug trade, whether it's online scamming or human trafficking and things like that. There are also, as you noted, ethnic armed groups that they've long supported on their border. So the Wa, the Kokang, these are armed groups that in the previous government, Aung San Suu Kyi's government, were also long fighting the Tatmadaw, and the Chinese were providing support to them in that struggle.
Deborah, you mentioned a very worrying aspect, which is that in this kind of a very splintered society and polity, basically what starts to happen in all the transnational crimes and all the illicit channels. Now, help us understand who are the real main stakeholders there? How is this happening? Of course, we know that recently Myanmar, in fact, displaced Afghanistan as world's #1 opium producer. So that's one. There's also a lot of cyber crime happening from there. But, help us understand better, because from a distance, of course, it's very worrying. But, you've had I would say a very first-hand experience of sort of working on them. Help me understand better. Who are the stakeholders there?
It's difficult when it comes to illicit crimes like that because there are actually a lot of stakeholders, including people who don't necessarily benefit from these crimes, but are finding ways to benefit, quite honestly. So, as you noted, it is now the largest heroin producer in the world, a huge amount of methamphetamine, a huge amount of fentanyl precursor and things like that. The cyber crimes, the human trafficking, there are different stakeholders in all of this. There are areas where, an average person who's living off subsistence has turned from farming one crop to poppy. Are they part of a problem? Of course. Are they the huge illicit organized crime wing taking money from this? No, and so there are really a lot of stakeholders here who are taking money off the top of what is a very, horrible set of factors.
So that's one part of the complication. The other part of the complication is the ethnic tension and all the refugees that have been making their way from there. And by the way, there are different kinds of refugees. Of course, in India, we talk mostly about the Rohingyas that happen to come from the Rakhine state. But also, that itself is a very, I would say, it's a very complex terrain. So what kind of humanitarian crisis do we see in terms of the mass exodus? Please help us understand that bit a little bit.
It's a huge crisis, both from the internally displaced persons who've just moved around in Myanmar, from the Rohingya crisis, which started long ago with the exodus of about 1 million Rohingya refugees into Bangladesh. That's probably the most acute and long-standing crisis. And there you're still seeing an influx of refugees, but you're also seeing a lot of instability in those camps, both not even from really the transition of government in Bangladesh, but because of terrorist groups in the camps, because of a lack of funding now towards the camps, whether it's a lack of USAID funding or the UN being underfunded for these sorts of actions. And then through warfare, internally displaced people or people that have moved to Chiang Mai or other areas of Thailand because their homes are no longer a viable place to be.
So if I ask you for an assessment of, for example, all these refugees and all the exodus that happens from Myanmar, which are the states that are worse affected? Of course, we know the Indian and the Bangladeshi side, but then what about the other states? Myanmar is also a Southeast Asian country.
It's all the neighbors. So really all the landlocked neighbors are absolutely, bearing witness and bearing refugees from this problem. So India, Bangladesh, Thailand, China, particularly of their ethnic brothers in Myanmar. So we are seeing just, an outflow of people, as well as I said, within Myanmar's own borders, just the internal displacement that's happened.
It's interesting because from India's perspective, we have always tried to play a more humanitarian role, in the Myanmar situation. And not going too long back, but then just keeping it more recent. So our External Affairs Minister now, Dr. Jaishankar, when he was Foreign Secretary, he actually went to Myanmar. This is around 2017 or so, when Myanmar and Bangladesh landed up signing an agreement on the exchange of, basically the return of all the refugees, because the problem was getting out of hand. So India went there, and we realized that we have to stabilize the Rakhine state. So basically, that's where it's all coming from. And then we pledged about 25 million US dollars to try and stabilize the state, but not much came out of it. So the question that I have for you is that why do you think that despite all these efforts at stabilizing the situation, we understand it's complicated, but then what better can be done to just stabilize the situation a bit so that the mass exodus doesn't happen?
There are a lot of factors there. I mean, part of the exodus that happened in Rakhine State, there are 135, I believe, recognized ethnic groups in Myanmar, of which the Rohingya are not one. They were seen as illegal migrants from Bangladesh. As borders are drawn, these things happen, and they were treated so horribly within Myanmar because of that. So the ethnic cleansing, really, of them out of Myanmar that happened about 7 years ago now, pushed so many Rohingya out of the country, either into Bangladesh or, to try to find better life at sea. And there were horrible tragedies there as well. Then you just have the constant fighting in the country that is also not helping any refugee situation, whether it be the Rohingya that remain or anybody else that is pushing into Bangladesh or India's borders. India, you mentioned some pledge of money. There's also, it's the trilateral road, I believe it's called, that bridges India's northeast to Myanmar and Thailand. That's a great idea. It's a great idea for both India and for Myanmar's development. And given the instability in the country, the constant warfare, these things don't come to fruition the way that they should. And I think, there will need to be a moment in which there has to be a decision of how we invest in Myanmar, how we get to stability in the country, what partners are working together to do that, so that you can see stability in your borders as well.
Right. And that also brings me to the very contested question of USAID. Because under Donald Trump, USAID has been a victim. He's stopped all funding for 90 days, and then there's a review. But frankly, the thing is that he's trying to dismantle this particular apparatus of American foreign policy, etc. Please, your thoughts on that?
From a policy perspective, I find it to be an unfortunate choice. I realize every administration comes with different strategic interests, and that's the will of the voters and how an administration goes forward. But it's long been said that the cost of development is much less than the cost of war, quite honestly. And so, the investment in countries through aid, through soft power initiatives, through this kind of support is something that I believe, and many others, including many Republican administrations, is a useful investment toward the future. I was heartened to see actually yesterday that after the earthquake, President Trump did say that we will provide support. I was very glad to see that. We'll see how these things come to fruition. But I do think that the lack of aid now coming into Myanmar from both USAID, and there were hundreds of millions of dollars of aid coming in over the years, as well as what will be a UN that is also a bit undermined or handicapped from not having as many Western funds as it had before. What are the decision-making points, and how much money can go to solve these crises?
And do you see a space for then other, say, for example, blocs such as the European Union? And I know that European Union has invested in this region in a big way by way of a lot of developmental projects. I also see a big player there, which is Japan, which is funding a lot of, I would say, developmental projects. So do you see a space for them opening up in terms of compensating for the loss perpetrated by USAID's withdrawal?
The whole loss, I'm not sure that's possible. But yes, Japan, Singapore, Korea, India, other countries have provided both aid in the past as well as efforts toward development. I'm hopeful that many entities will rally after the earthquake. The last reports I saw, there's still only hundreds said to be dead. It's going to be thousands, many thousands of people. There's going to be a decimation of infrastructure. I mean, obviously, we've seen the decimation go all the way to Bangkok. And so there will be a lot of needs for the country. My hope is that, the military government can also accept this aid in a way, or not the military government, but actors can get into the country in a way to actually provide help. So, will the Red Cross be able to come in and provide help, including in ethnic areas that the military doesn't control? What about the UN? What about other actors? And I think that's where we're going to need to see, how does the military really want to serve the many people in the country at this really horrifying moment.
But for now, the military government actually controls a very tiny part of towards the center, right, of Myanmar,
Correct.
as you can also see on the map in the center. So how does this then get distributed? Because to actually make sure that the aid reaches the people that are most devastated by these impacts, that itself is a task, Deborah.
It's truly an open question. I mean, I remember years ago when the country was more open, I was traveling into some of these, ethnic states, and there were still, checkpoints and, hurdles that I as an average citizen had to go through. It remains to be seen if aid even if the aid is not centralized, what access will aid groups have to provide this? And that is something that may be under the military's control. It's possible that, going through border areas, what will China allow into the ethnic states on their border? What kind of negotiated solution can there be? The same on the India and Bangladesh side. And we'll have to get, a real tally of what the devastation is throughout the country.
And this is just for the devastation which is caused by the earthquake. And generally, Myanmar is always on the brink of a humanitarian crisis for all the reasons that you just told me. Now, talking about all these international actors, we discussed China, we discussed the US, we discussed Japan, the European Union. But there's another actor, international actor, that has been trying to deepen its strategic ties with the military government. That is Russia.
Yes.
And very recently, I think it is just a couple of weeks ago that they had a meeting, and then they sort of vowed to deepen their ties. What are Russia's interests there?
I mean, Russia has interest in perhaps an instability, or Russia has interest in friendshoring on its own side. There are things like critical minerals and lots of natural resources in Myanmar that are of interest to, frankly, all of Myanmar's neighbors and others around the world. But I actually think there are significant interests in Myanmar towards Russia. The Min Aung Hlaing, the senior general of Myanmar who's running the country, also needs to diversify support from China. He's looking for other actors to be able to help their military. And so actually the biggest supporter of Myanmar's military is not China, it's Russia in terms of hard numbers. And so I think, he's looking for armaments. There are some cases in which Russian technology and jets have been superior to China's, so he's looking for that. And he's looking for other, outlays of support, including from other neighboring countries, so that they're not entirely dependent on China, as they have sort of been in the past.
So that's interesting because, yes, a lot of India's neighbors have problems with Chinese defense equipment. And we were just recently discussing that that also opens up the space. So China is the number one defense supplier to countries like Pakistan and Bangladesh, which is a concern for India. But then they themselves are not very happy with the Chinese weapons because they're not battle tested. And of course, Russia is a more traditional, so to say, weapon supplier. But help me understand if my reading is that, so how should India respond to that? So why I ask you this question is because India has been traditionally friends with Russia. So having Russia in our backyard is something which a lot of Indians would argue is comfortable for India. On the other hand, there is also a situation because of the war in Ukraine where you see Russia becoming a junior partner to China. So in that sense, do we see that the way this dynamic will play out is where it's Russia serving China's interest perhaps in the region, or do you think that it is basically diversification? So from India's perspective, it's better. Help me understand that. It's complex, but I think you're the right person to answer that.
I'm not sure that's a bigger regional question than perhaps I grapple with. But, I'd say, one, Russia and China have a symbiotic relationship in which they are useful supports to each other. they can choose to engage or not engage on things based on also knowing that their southern flank or northern flank, depending on which country you're talking about, is secured by the other. I think what India and other countries who neighbor Myanmar to the west will have to decide is, how much do they feel they want to manage the strategic competition with China through Myanmar, and what does that mean for securing those eastern borders, and what does that mean for what actors they engage with to do that?
So in that sense, do you think there's a link to how the great power contestation then unfolds in the Indo-Pacific if we just try to sort of make Myanmar and whatever's happening there with respect to all these actors that you mentioned as a subset? Do you think there's a link there?
I do. I mean, Myanmar also has a lot of things going for it, were it not in this horrible crisis, as I mentioned, and a significant amount of natural resources and things like that. A pretty unspoiled country, actually. If you've spent time there, there's still quite nice soil there. You could do nice organic farming in Myanmar and things like that. And so there's still a lot of trees and greenery and water and the ability for hydropower, and it's also the gateway to getting through instead of going through the Straits of Malacca to getting through better seaport access and things like that for Gulf countries, as well as getting to China and to the rest of Southeast Asia. So there is a lot of ability there for Myanmar to be an ally to a number of countries, but it's also kind of at a demarcation point between, I'd say, Southwest Asia and further east, where I think a lot of countries wonder, is this kind of a bulwark into getting into China, just as many see, Ukraine as that into getting into Russia.
Yeah. Also, it's interesting because you mentioned the geographical location of Myanmar, which is definitely both a curse and a blessing, to it. So Myanmar is also part of several regional organizations. And from India's perspective, see, like I said, that we have always tried to make Myanmar a part of our regional arrangements. So you mentioned the trilateral highway, of course, but then Myanmar is also part of, BIMSTEC. Myanmar is a part of ASEAN countries. It's a bit of an outlier out there, but it still is a part of ASEAN countries. We've been discussing India and all that. What has been the response of the other ASEAN countries to this ever, so to say, green crisis in Myanmar?
Soon after the coup, the ASEAN countries came together with a 5-point consensus plan of how to engage with Myanmar and what will happen next. And unfortunately, this plan kind of really lacked teeth. It lacked any ability to do much. And now, 4 years later into the coup, that's certainly the case. ASEAN has a general principle of we don't mess with the domestic affairs of other countries. It's an economic group. And I think, it will come to a point of how can we move forward with Myanmar? Who do we engage with in Myanmar? Is a military junta in control, not an elected party? There are certainly takeaways to have from other countries like Indonesia that have made significant transitions. And that made more sense during an Aung San Suu Kyi period when you're transitioning from military into a democracy. I think at some point there will have to be a question of how useful is Myanmar in this framework, and also truly what is the future of Myanmar? Will we see a Syria-style regime collapse? Will we see another framework of fragmentation? Will we see a federalist kind of state? And I think, some of these entities will have to start thinking about what those futures look like and what engagement looks like. I'd love for ASEAN to be able to engage more. It's interesting now that the chair of ASEAN is Malaysia. Malaysia has a long-standing interest in helping Myanmar, particularly in the Rohingya crisis. They were a helpful entity in terms of wanting to provide for the Rohingya. So we'll see, given their chairmanship, how is Myanmar on the ASEAN agenda for this year and what can be done?
Deborah, in a more, let's, right now perhaps is not the right time because it's quite unstable, but I'd still like to pick your brains, and this is taking you back to the report that you authored. I'm sure you must have come out with certain suggestions in terms of what the regional actors can do better. So if you could just help me understand from India's perspective, what do you think a country like India can do better for Myanmar, if you have any suggestions. And of course, you can give me other suggestions also with respect to the bigger powers, but particularly from India's perspective.
It's an interesting question because India also engages with who's in power, right? So they've been engaging with the military government. They have a significant border with Myanmar. How do they keep their border safe? This makes perfect sense. But I do think it's worthwhile for other countries to also understand who the other players are, as I'm sure government does. And are there possibilities of working together to some kind of solution? There are a number of diplomatic dialogues happening, these kind of track 2, track 1.5 dialogues that India has helped bring together to have these conversations. I have been wondering, on the American side, obviously, we talked about under this new administration, geostrategic interests or how you would engage with those have changed. But President Trump has long had a problem with fentanyl coming into the United States, and has taken on China pretty vociferously about that. But Myanmar is such a quagmire in terms of the heroin production and fentanyl precursor production. That is there a conversation that could bring both India and the United States to the table on the future of Myanmar that would engage this administration in the States from the illicit crime perspective, but also, strategically, both countries want to manage the competition with China. So is there some kind of conversation that can be had of what does the future look like for Myanmar? How do we think about that? How do we think about the China piece of the equation? And what do we think about providing assistance to the country?
So traditionally, when we try to understand India's role in the neighborhood, there has been a tendency on the Indian part to sort of try and engage with one of the factions, or perhaps, like you just said, that if there is a military government out there, so most of the overtures that from Indian side have been to that government. On the contrary, we see that a lot of arch rivals such as China have a more comprehensive engagement. So they engage not only with the government but all other relevant stakeholders. And I think what you're trying to say here is that if you want to make all these kind of things work, you have to develop some kind of an outreach, formally, informally, semi-formally, with other stakeholders as well. If is that what you're trying to say here?
It is, and I do believe, this country has such incredible diplomats that I can't imagine that there hasn't been engagement, particularly on the border towards stability. But it is an open question of what kind of dialogues and frameworks need to be in place for a future of Myanmar. Who is coming to the table to think about what does a Myanmar 3.0, look like in terms of transition. What actors are brought together, whether it's the National Unity Government and ethnic armed groups, to come to some negotiated solution. I don't want to sound Pollyanna-ish about it, but I do think that there are some next steps to take there because, frankly, a Syria regime-style collapse also benefits nobody, including India or any of Myanmar's neighbors.
Right. So if I just pose you this interesting question, because the situation in the country is so volatile, what do you think, in your opinion, and from your research, of course, because you have done considerable research on this subject, what are the best case scenarios and the worst case scenarios for Myanmar in the next decade?
What's happening in the country now is honestly very tragic. What I would love to see, and this probably does sound a bit naive, but you'd love to see a space in which you can get back towards a real, inclusive, and credible government. Part of the aid that China is providing Myanmar will be for doing a census and doing elections. But as we said, the military government doesn't control all of Myanmar. How do you do a census in areas you don't control or feel safe in? And then how do you run an election when you won't let the NLD or other parties, be involved? None of that is inclusive or credible. is there a way to get to a military stand down? Is there a way to come to a negotiated solution for power sharing between ethnic armed groups and other entities? Is there a way to pick up some of the threads that were becoming successful before the coup? There have been in other countries, and I don't think this would be the case in Myanmar, but where, you see a leader who wants to negotiate their way out, a military leader who wants to negotiate their way out because they feel the writing's on the wall. I don't see that happening here, but I do wonder, if it gets to a point where the Tatmadaw cannot hold their ground, and we've seen that come close pretty often, who has already been at the table to think about the future of Myanmar so that you don't have chaos and fragmentation and an even, more hostile civil war happening, but that we've thought about, how do we power share? What would a constitution look like? And what is that? And so that to me is kind of a best case scenario of thinking about that power sharing. The worst case scenario, I mean, right now is pretty bad. It's pretty horrendous, and the natural disasters which Myanmar is prone to, whether it's an earthquake or a cyclone or something else, just constantly beating a country that is becoming more and more isolated.
I often, when we are trying to understand these disasters, one often sort of gives a parallel between what Haiti is for the Central Americas is what perhaps Myanmar seems to be here in this side of the world. Let's hope that this doesn't get worse than this, because it's already very, very bad. And I hope that, even if not the best case scenario, but perhaps something which is more on the positive side, something which is more realistic can be put together. I don't see that happening without the involvement of the bigger regional actors, and I think a lot will depend on how will that play out. But perhaps one of the things I want to understand from you is that where do you see the future of Aung San Suu Kyi? How do people think about her? I think very briefly, it was just her that brought some top-down democracy in Myanmar. And I ask you for a reason, because she remains very popular in India. She went to college in India at the Lady Shri Ram College. So tell us a little bit about, you've met her, spoken to her. What is her future?
I'm sad to say that she's sort of sitting in jail in Naypyidaw still. I don't know what her future holds. I know that, I think particularly further west, she became sort of a fallen idol to many, particularly with the Rohingya crisis. And I think while that was a horrendous crisis, and obviously everybody wished that she would do more and speak out more at the time, she was in, as we clearly see now, this complete balancing act with the military, because you're right, she was holding on to a very fragile and nascent transition, and the military didn't like where the country was headed for them, and so they grabbed power under the auspices of a security framework, and she. Some people will say she's under house arrest. She's not. She is in jail. She is. I'm sure not being treated well, not being able to engage with other people, probably has very limited access to the internet and to books and things like that. You're hopeful for anybody who's been a fighter for freedom and democracy and humanity to not be treated in that way, and you're hopeful for their release and their life to come back into order. And I hope that's the case. I'm told she's, increasingly, not fragile, but, as we all get older.
And she's also getting old.
Yeah.
She's, I think, must be in her late 70s.
Yeah, exactly. And so, I'm hopeful that she's able to see a Myanmar that once again transitions towards the future and towards the order that she was hoping to create.
So thanks for, throwing light on that and Aung San Suu Kyi and, her state right now. But also, haven't the military junta declared that they are going to be holding elections sometimes? And so do you see Myanmar inching to some kind of stability, even if not democracy, or some democracy, even of some kind of a standoff between democracy and political stability versus the military intervention?
It's hard to run an election when you don't control the whole country. So that's one piece. Can you run an election in all of these ethnic areas where there are tens of millions of people? What does that vote look like? they're not going to run an election that is open to every party. What does that mean for Aung San Suu Kyi's party and the NLD and other actors? And as the military has done in the past, in the 90s, this will be an election that the military wins. So, I don't think it's moving towards any different outcome than the current one. It will be a very controlled, kind of unfair election to prop up their power. It's a fake election. And they said when they grabbed power in February 2021, they said, I believe at that point, in a year we'll have an election. So we're now 4 years later. Perhaps they'll have an election, but it will not be anything that's open or bringing forward any kind of democratic order.
So in India, we are waiting for another election to be held in our neighborhood, which is in Bangladesh. And we keep talking about that, but I'm glad we're also discussing Myanmar and what these elections could mean. And you are, I think you did not mince your words at all, saying that these are going to be fake elections and don't have any hope from them. But Deborah, you've also been on the ground, done your research and everything. So the report that you extensively, that extensive report that you put together came out in 2018. We are living in a different world. It's 2025. And there's not only Donald Trump, there's also wars happening all over. There's the Russia-Ukraine war. There's also unrest in the Middle East. There's also a different kind of an equation for Taiwan, basically Indo-Pacific. Do you intend to do a follow-up on that report? What is ASPI doing there? What are you doing for Myanmar now?
So we're convening a lot of conversations on Myanmar. As you said, there's so much happening in the world that has, I think, pulled attention, and that makes complete sense. But how do we bring people's attention back to Myanmar? What can the country look like? Why should people care who aren't there? Not just those on their borders, but people around the world. You have 50 million people in this country is being devastated. There is strategic interest of a lot of players here, and how do we keep this in a conversation? So that's what we're focused on at the moment. You're right, we should do a follow-up report. It is a much different country. We are doing a series of podcasts as well that will come out soon with those around the region about what they feel can be done by regional players. So look forward to that at our website at asiasocietypolicyinstitute.org.
Okay, and could you also just tell the viewers who are watching it here and who are interested in Myanmar as to how can that report be accessed? So it's available on the ASPI website?
It's available on our websites, yes. So just check out asiasociety.org and you can find us from there.
Okay, and just outside of Asia Society, if there are any recommendations that you have for a lot of people who want to understand just how complex the situation is and remains to be?
Yeah, there are a number of think tanks and other institutions out there who are working on Myanmar from different frames. I'd actually say you could start with UN papers about kind of the humanitarian situation and what's happening on the ground. That's always a great place to start, and they do very active updates. So I'd say start there and then come back to Asia Society and take a look.
Yeah, for sure. So so the website that she's mentioned and also the UN papers, but perhaps also some books or some other references?
There are a number of books. There's actually an interesting one. It's a little bit older now, but Thant Minh U's book of Where China Meets India is about Myanmar, which might be interesting from the perspective here. But there are actually also some newspapers that are coming out of, or had been coming out of Myanmar that could be interesting. Frontier Myanmar has some information. The Irrawaddy still publishes some information. So I'd check out those sources as well, as they're covering it from a local perspective.
Wow, that's a wealth of, I would say, research material for anybody that wants to understand it better. And on that note, Deborah, let me thank you once again for taking the time out, coming to studio and speaking to us, on a situation which is frankly our backyard, but we unfortunately don't discuss it often. And with this discussion that we had today, it was not just about India, but also this complex interplay of so many other, international actors and regional politics and how it kind of segues into another, and discussing about a society that remains very fragile. So thank you so much, Deborah, and wishing you all the best.
Thank you, Swasti. It was such a pleasure. Thanks for having me.